we're going to pause now and see if any of the task force members have any questions about these three presentations just made. Recognizing that I think everybody needs to go onto the Marine Cadastre and run ocean reports themselves. There's a lot more exploration to be done there. So if members of the task force have questions they want to raise, please click on the participants tab and find the raise hand icon at the bottom. Click on that and we'll get you in the queue. So I see Brandon Fry.
That's correct.
Yeah, I want you hop in.
Okay, I have a question for Walt. When he was showing some of his modeling and the megawatt hour pricing of 73 to 91, I was curious if whether transmission costs were modeled into that or that was just a power cost.
No, they don't include the onshore transmission costs. There's a default variable that's something like 5 kilometers of land-based transmission is included, but since we haven't really studied the points of interconnect or those variables, those costs were not included, but it does include the offshore wind substation and the export cable and the electrical infrastructure that's included with building the wind farm.
Do you know if have there been any studies anywhere else as to what that could potentially look like, even in a rough range?
Yeah, there have been. There's some ongoing studies now that I don't have the answers for that. There's a lot of this is a big area that's just starting to illuminate itself. I think the West Coast is looking at that. Hasn't really got numbers yet for what those costs would look like. The East Coast is probably the closest because there's going to be probably a glut on interconnection points when you start connecting 30 gigawatts on all those spaces, and the benefits of transmission of aggregation and cooperation are becoming clear economically. And so I think we should be looking at that very carefully as we go forward.
Okay, thanks. That's all I have.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. Brandon, if you could just say who you're with or what your affiliation.
Sure, I'm the Executive Secretary for the Louisiana Public Service Commission.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Okay, and I have, if you could put your hand down, please, Brandon. I have Robert Fars.
Yes, thank you. I actually wanted to chime in to follow up on this transmission cost estimate question, just as background data. So the way that process works is actually anytime a resource wants to interconnect to one of the transmission provider systems, they actually have to go through a pretty long and complex process, and the transmission provider will do a study in kind of analyzing their system and what transmission upgrades might be necessary. And again, this is all in the case of offshore wind. We're talking about the onshore transmission upgrades, not the actual lines and substations that would be in the water that Walt referred to. And so in order to determine those costs, it's really a case-by-case study where the transmission provider analyzes its system and does some pretty sophisticated electrical modeling in order to figure out what upgrades are necessary in order to achieve the deliverability that the developer of the generator wants to achieve. And so, the result of that study will directly kind of provide a cost to the interconnecting resource. And I think, as more and more of these wind resources go through the interconnection process, there will be more data on the range of those costs. We call them network upgrade costs. That's kind of the FERC term for it. And I work with FERC, if I didn't say that at the beginning. Yes, so I think it's very, these costs can be very variable, and they're very much a case-by-case basis to the extent that there's this long study done for each interconnecting resource.
So the default on that is generator lead lines, which are each individual project finds a suitable connection point, maybe typically at a retiring power plant, and plugs in at those locations. But those aren't as available as some of the maybe broader needs that the system has to upgrade, and those aren't always being looked at, especially in the first projects that have the availability of decent interconnect points, but may not be looking at the benefits of the whole as we expand to larger gigawatt scale.
Okay, well, thank you, Robert, for that comment, and Walt for following up. See one more hand up, and then we'll move on to our next suite of presentations. So Chet Chason, and please introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Chet Chason. I'm the executive director for Port Fourchon down here in South Louisiana and right on the Gulf of Mexico. I guess my question is kind of a follow-up to what was just discussed in terms of transmission. So when does that come into the process? You know, we're talking about offshore wind and creating the power, but transmitting it back to the grid is critically important, obviously, as part of the process. So when does that come into any of these study processes as we look forward, and the actuality of creating these wind farms in the Gulf and getting the power back to land, back to the grid?
You're talking about the broad scale cost that's necessary, or or on a project basis, when does it come in? If it's the latter, we should probably maybe get somebody from BOEM to address that.
And
But,
I guess to add to that, I guess it's the investor who's going to be creating the wind farm has to think about the best bang for their buck, so to speak, as to where they would put that farm to have the best location to provide that transmission back to land, back to the grid.
Yeah, so I mean, in the ISO, at the ISO level, they've been looking at that up north as an independent ISOs, and how they might integrate X number of gigawatts at different locations. It's a process that has to really, to do it right, you have to include the other energy sources that are being integrated, not just the offshore wind. So it's a little more complicated, and so maybe others may want to address that in a different way. I know that Robert had really good comments on that and is looking at that on a broader scale.
Right. Is this from BOEM, Josh Ganji? Is this something that you could weigh in on?
Yeah. So I'll be giving a presentation on BOEM's process for transmission in about 15 minutes, I think. So maybe I can address some of your questions there, and if not, definitely come back on and we'll talk some more.
All right. So Chet, thank you for that question, and this is the perfect segue then into given our timing. I'd like to move into the next suite of 3 presentations.